Okay, first upcoming courses, the only one to report is Natural and Human Law, Foundations of Civil Society with our director, Daniel Campbell, beginning the last week of July with classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then that'll run until the first week of September. Morning, evening classes, both Tuesdays and Thursdays. And it includes a tuition credit towards any year-long course next year. So if you're enrolled in the biblical school or the catechetical school, or you know there's an enrichment class you'll be taking, sign up for this course because essentially it's free. All right. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, vita dulcedo et spes nostra salve. Ad te clamamus, exules filii Eve. Ad te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in hoc lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo, advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordes oculos, ad nos converte. Et Iesum, benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis post hoc auxilium ostende. O clemens, O pia, O dulcis, Virgo Maria. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay, so tonight, the third of the four quartets, the dry salvages. Again, the structure that the critic Kenneth Paul Kramer came up with, which can be somewhat helpful in understanding this. Again, each of the quartets has 5 movements, and all of the movements share something in common. In this schema, the first 2 movements, a composition of place and then an inner geography of the soul. I'm not sure how much I agree with that description, but they would perform the preparatory reflections. 3 and 4, the via negativa or positiva, and then the via purgativa, suggest the inner quietude. And then the 5th movement, middle way immediacy, calls itself to unitive contemplation. It makes sense to a certain extent, but it shouldn't be insisted upon too much. As a way of making sense of what is here and what are the interconnections between the movements, it's helpful. And if thinking about it this way leads you to point out where, maybe all of the part 2s aren't really inner geographies of the soul, you're then thinking across the quartets the way that T.S. Eliot would want you to, at least. So the dry salvages, this is the only of the quartets that begins with one of T.S. Eliot's own notes. Someone wrote to him asking exactly what the dry salvages were. So in his own style, he imagined himself as an editor writing a note, which is the dry salvages, presumably Les Trois Sauvages, is a small group of rocks with a beacon off the New England coast of Cape Ann, the northeast coast of Cape Ann, Massachusetts. Salvages is pronounced to rhyme with assuages. Groaner is a whistling boy. So before we even begin, if we notice that last week with East Coker, T.S. Eliot brought us back to his ancestral home. Here, he's taking us across the Atlantic Ocean to his personal home. There are 2 places that dominate the first movement of the dry salvages. These rocks off of the coast of Cape Ann, Massachusetts, where T.S. Eliot had his summer home as a boy. Not his summer home, but a family summer home, where he spent most of his summers until he left for Europe. The other place that is not mentioned by name but is clearly intended is the Mississippi River. T.S. Eliot was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, which between 1893 and 1911 was very much a Southern city in terms of culture. Eliot says as much in a letter from 1930, but he notes that this old Southern city is almost unrecognizable already by 1930. What a lot of this points to is the fact that Eliot, as he also describes in another letter, was something of an eternal exile. Um, he ended up foregoing his American citizenship and becoming a British citizen. But even though he was enamored with everything British, he recognized that he himself wasn't really British. Some of his letters bear the delightful signature um, of metoikos, which is a Greek word meaning a resident alien, somebody who is not a citizen of whatever city state it is they're living in, but is lawfully there and welcomed by the state. So that's how he saw himself, basically, as a lifelong exile who was given the benefits of English citizenship. So last week's was the Elliott family homecoming, returning to East Coker, where he traces ancestry. Tonight is going back to his personal history. And when he's writing these lines, he's been in England for almost all of the previous 30 years, including virtually his entire poetic career. He went back to the United States briefly, 1930, 31, and he lectured at Harvard for a period, but then returned. And so he's conjuring up a world that, as he recognizes, is already gone. That of St. Louis, the southern city, and yet another layer of exile. Eliot, his family is from New England, so they're absolutely considered Yankees in the South at a time when the Civil War was living memory for virtually all of the adults. I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable. Patient to some degree, at first recognized as a frontier, useful, untrustworthy as a conveyor of commerce. Then only a problem confronting the builder of bridges. The problem once solved, the brown god is almost forgotten by dwellers in cities. Ever, however, implacable. Keeping his seasons and rages, destroyer, reminder of what men choose to forget. Unhonored, unpropitiated by worshippers of the machine, but waiting, watching and waiting. His rhythm was present in the nursery bedroom, in the rank ailanthus of the April dooryard, in the smell of grapes on the autumn table, and in the evening circle in the winter gaslight. So the Mississippi River of his youth, that, as he said in St. Louis, I mean, the Mississippi River dominates as very few geographical markers dominate any region. Um, and we go from the nursery bedroom. So we start off with the youth of man, and then we go through the seasons. So we have both the presence of the river throughout the entire year, but also as the years roll by and the age of man rolls by, from the nursery bedroom of infancy to the winter gaslight of old age and death. And as always, death is just below the surface of the poetry. And here we have something, one of those delightful points of comparison between Tolkien and T.S. Eliot, both deeply suspicious of the modern. the river, a strong brown god, untamed and untractable, is now solved by the builder of bridges. The worshippers of the machine can forget the power of the river, but the river doesn't forget its own power. And the basic religious sentiment of modern. Eliot, of course, not suggesting that we worship pagan river gods, but we notice unhonored, unpropitiated by worshippers of the machine. In many ways, applies to absolutely how Europe views Christ at this time, and increasingly today in the United States. For the worshippers of the machine, everything that is not the machine is what men choose to forget. Until, of course, the river unleashes its torrent and men are forced to. And that theme that has run throughout the four quartets so far, modern man with his machine and his utter desire to forget everything except himself, to be distracted by distraction from distraction, as Eliot said in Bert Norton. Here we have the people living on the banks of the Mississippi River. But once that bridge has been built, and the first bridge over the Mississippi River wasn't constructed, I want to say, until the early 1890s, just due to the size of the Mississippi River. It was a very late first bridge. But once that first bridge goes up, and you no longer even have to worry about the river taking ferries back and forth, it becomes something that we choose to forget. But it's always there, waiting, watching, and waiting. Very similar to meditations on death in previous sections, and as we'll see in this one. The river is within us. The sea is all about us. The sea is the land's edge also, the granite into which it reaches, the beaches where it tosses its hints of earlier and other creation, the starfish, the horseshoe crab, the whale's backbone, the pools where it offers to our curiosity the more delicate algae in the sea anemone. It tosses up our losses, the torn sand, the shattered lobster pout, the broken oar, and the gear of foreign dead men. The sea has many voices, many gods, and many voices. So the Mississippi, of course, pours into the sea in the Gulf of Mexico, but it's the same sea that also borders on England. The river here shows us the flow of time, not represents, not a metaphor, but literally is a case in point of the flow of time. Certainly he had in mind that bit of pre-Socratic philosophy. You cannot step into the same river twice. Because what we call a river materially is not the same thing. The water that passes by once and then never again. But the sea, however, the sea is virtually eternal. And so the river and the sea in the dry salvages, again, with the sacramentalist worldview that Eliot has, it's a case in point of time meeting timelessness. The earlier and other creation, the starfish, the horseshoe crab, which is just remarkable for timelessness, one of the oldest creatures that is basically still in the form it had 400 million years ago. The whale's backbone, and the bone on the beach will come back again later. And it tosses up our analysis. What had been experienced through time is brought back to a later time. The shattered lobster pot, the broken oar, and the gear of foreign dead men. The salt is on the briar rose. The fog is in the fir trees. Characteristics of the sea coming in onto land. The sea howl and the sea yelp are different voices, often together heard. the whine in the rigging, the menace and caress of wave that breaks on water, the distant rote in the granite teeth, and the wailing warning from the approaching headland are all sea voices, and the heaving groaner rounded homewards, and the seagull. And Eliot himself, when he spent those summers at the family home in Gloucester on Cape Ann, he learned to sail, and he was capable of taking his own boat out into open waters. And the dry salvages, the rocks that he's referring to, are the last sea mark that he would have passed on his way out to sea, and it would have been the first sea mark that he would have seen on his way back. So as he rounded homewards on these sailing journeys in the 1900s, these rocks themselves are that sea mark that lets you know that you're on course. However, these rocks here, it's a granite cliff, and they are always visible, but beneath them are two other features that disappear at high tide. There's a long reef that runs 500 feet, and there's another granite structure that runs something like 30 or 40 extra. And so it's necessary to have those buoys, the whistling of the groan or the bell that rings in the waves of the sea, to alert any sailors in fog that they're coming too close. The rocks themselves are, in clear weather, a sign that you've returned, but in bad weather, in storm or fog where you can't see, it's potential death. And under the oppression of the silent fog, the tolling bell measures time, not our time, rung by the unhurried groundswell, a time older than the time of chronometers, older than time counted by anxious, worried women, lying awake, calculating the future, trying to unweave, unwind, unravel, and piece together the past and the future. Between midnight and dawn, when the past is all deception, the future futureless, before the morning watch, when time stops and time is never ending, and the groundswell that is and was from the beginning clangs the bell. And so we have the bell ring, measuring a time that is not our, that timeless time, that bit of eternity that is the sea. And we notice that this bell tolls. In English, bells only toll at funerals. They ring in other places. They can clang in others, but a tolling bell is always one announcing death. And we go from the tolling of this bell that rings constantly as the waves come in and out to the time that's counted by the anxious, worried women, the wives of sailors, because Gloucester, of course, was a prominent fishing village, and generations of women waited for their husbands to come home, hoping that they would come home. The incredibly dangerous work that is being a fisherman. The women lying awake, calculating the future, trying to unweave, unwind, unravel, and piece together the past and future between midnight and dawn, when the past is all deception, the future futureless. Another case in point that goes to something almost universal, that is the wife at home waiting for the husband to return from dangerous work, never being able to be certain that the husband will return until he comes through that door. The nervous nights that are spent unable to sleep and calculating the future. that time when the past is all deception and the future futureless. Um, so much of the four quartets is a meditation not just on time, but the relation of past and future, and the momentary experience of past and future in this particular moment for these women. The past is all deception and the future futureless. Before the morning watch, when time stops and time is never ending. And the second movement. Where is there an end of it? The soundless wailing, the silent withering of autumn flowers, dropping their petals and remaining motionless. Where is there an end to the drifting wreckage? The prayer of the bone on the beach, the unprayable prayer at the calamitous annunciation. So one common bit between all of these second movements is they all seem to ask, when is the end of all of this decay? And the answer, of course, is always never. The decay and construction and destruction is simply the rhythm of time. Soundless wailing, the silent withering of autumn flowers. That is an image that has a long history in Western literature. The withering of the autumn flowers falling to the ground is used both in biblical and in far classical literature as a representation of the death of man. It goes all the way back to the Iliad and then picked up again, of course, by Virgil. And in the Bible, I'm not remembering this off the top of my head, but I believe it's in Proverbs. Where is there an end to the drifting wreckage? The prayer of the bone on the beach. What could the prayer of the bone on the beach possibly be? To be that which it once was? The unprayable prayer at the calamitous annunciation. Now, annunciation here has a small a, but it's impossible to use that word without pointing to the annunciation. The unprayable prayer at the calamitous annunciation. And although he's not talking about the annunciation, for Mary, the annunciation was calamitous. In a moment, a 13-year-old girl has whatever life she had imagined for herself torn apart. To be the greatest human participant in the incarnation, but an incarnation that can only end in her suffering, the sword through her heart. The unprayable prayer at the calamitous annunciation, the prayer of the bone on the beach. I have no solid interpretation for those lines. But of course, by the words that he's choosing, those draw us forward to the Annunciation. And of course, at the Annunciation, the only prayer, the unprayable prayer for modern man, fiat mihi, let it be done unto me according to thy will. And Eliot will use the word Annunciation once again in this section with the lowercase a. And the point that he's making is that, yes, there is the specific Annunciation. But in terms of what the Annunciation calls for, which is the abandonment of ego to the will of God, human history is filled with Annunciations. In a sense, the Four Quartets itself is an Annunciation, in that it's providing recognition that the only real option in this life is that unprayable prayer of that fiat mihi, be it done unto me according to thy will. For the modern man of 1941, of course, the abandonment of will is unprayable. If that's exactly what Eliot is looking at in these lines, I don't know. Most likely he has several. The lines have multiple significances. There is no end but addition. So where is there an end of it? There is no end. Only addition, the trailing consequence of further days and hours, while emotion takes to itself the emotionless years of living among the breakage of what was believed in as the most reliable, and therefore the fittest for renunciation. So as the days and hours go on, there's no end to decay. There is no end to suffering. And the years of living teach us that what we believed was most reliable. And what are the things we find most reliable in this life? Whatever that is. I mean, we know what the answer should be, but in a practical sense of day-to-day life, for most people, what is it that they find most reliable? Whether it's wealth, career, status, family, friends, all of those things will fail. Living among the breakage of what was believed in as the most reliable. Whatever thing that is not God that you put full hope in will fail. It is inevitable because that is the nature of creation as we live in it. So there can be no end of the soundless wailing, the silent withering of autumn flowers, only the addition. There is the final addition, the failing pride or resentment at failing powers, the unattached devotion, which might pass for devotionless, in a drifting boat with a slow leakage, the silent listening to the undeniable clamor of the bell of the last Annunciation. And so here we come upon everything that you believed in your life fails you bit by bit as the years go by until your body fails you. The failing pride or resentment at failing powers. If we think of a life that ends in old age, the humiliation that having to be cared for can bring. If we imagine ourselves as self-supported, completely independent beings, being led by others in everything that you have to do, the failing pride or resentment at failing powers, the unattached devotion, which might pass for devotionless in a drifting boat with slow leakage. So that life that is spent sputtering in old age, like a boat with slow leakage, and the unattached devotion, which might pass for devotionless. What exactly he intends by that, whether it's a critique of the pretended disattachment that is becoming popular, that in France after World War II will develop into I'm blanking on words again, forgive me, existentialism. Existentialism, the philosophy of saying that all is random chance and nothing really matters, but it can matter if you decide to make it matter. It's just utter nonsense. But that life certainly calls the image of a drifting boat with slow leakage. The silent listening to the undeniable clamor of the bell of the last Annunciation. And that would seem pretty clearly to be the bell, the last Annunciation that is of bodily death. Where is the end of them? The fishermen sailing into the wind's tail where the fog cowers. We cannot think of a time that is oceanless, or of an ocean not littered with wastage, or of a future that is not liable, like the past, to have no destination. We have to think of them as forever bailing, setting and hauling, while the northeast lowers over shallow banks, unchanging and erosionless, or drawing their money, drying sails at dockage, not as making a trip that will be unpayable for a haul that will not bear examination. We cannot think of a time that is oceanless. The ocean is our experience of timelessness in mortal life. We also can't think of an ocean that isn't littered with the wastage of the past. Likewise, you cannot think of a future that can be any different. That is, that can be without the same destination as everything in the past was. That houses will all fall and crumble. And we have to think of them as forever. These fishermen and their desperate attempts. When the northeast wind, the northeast storm lowers, that makes that bellowing sound of cattle, uh, determining the fate of sailors sinking ships at sea, or drawing their money by keeping them in port. Not as making a trip that will be unpayable for a haul that will not bear examination. The final trip, um, the trip for which there is no, that will be unpayable. That is that the fishermen, there's no money to be made from that last trip because the haul that you bring in won't bear examination. That is the final the judgment of the soul after death. There is no end of it, the voiceless wailing, no end to the withering of withered flowers, to the movement of pain that is painless and motionless, to the drift of the sea and the drifting wreckage, the bones' prayer to death, its God. Only the hardly, barely prayable prayer of the one Annunciation. So there is no end of the wastage, the destruction, the ruin that is life, that is history, that is human history throughout all of it. The movement of pain that is painless and motionless. The constancy of suffering. To the drift of the sea and the drifting wreckage, the bones' prayer to death, its God. And we have the answer to all of this, that all of this will continue. There will be no future utopia on earth. All that we have is the hardly, barely prayable prayer of the one Annunciation. Be it done unto me according to thy will. The renunciation of will, the renunciation of life as an independent venture, that the only way through life that isn't an illusion or unremitting pain is to submit with our will to the will of God, in which we receive for it is joy. But the only possible way to receive that divine joy is through that complete submission, the hardly, barely prayable prayer of the one Annunciation. It seems as one becomes older that the past has another pattern and ceases to be a mere sequence. And once again, patterns, patterns of history, patterns of knowledge that we have to put onto experience to make sense of them, but of course are limiting. But the past has another pattern and ceases to be a mere sequence or even development. The latter a partial fallacy encouraged by superficial notions of evolution, which becomes in the popular mind a means of disowning the past. So that question of development, of human progress, that is just the core belief of secular humanism from the French Revolution to today, that society is constantly progressing. And of course, and Eliot's made this point before, that technology can progress, yes, but human morality does not. Uh, the behavior of people to other people, a partial fallacy encouraged by superficial notions of evolution. Applying the idea of evolution to everything, we end up with the self-satisfied smirk as we look at the past of people before us who were not quite as intelligent, who lacked some of the virtue that we have. If we remember that poster, that poster that shows evolution beginning with some primitive creature and then going through apes and then finally man, and always masculine man walking at the end. And then if we would take what the natural conclusion of that is, from natural man walking naked into the more moral modern man, that of course we always imagine ourselves to be. The idea that the latest generation is the most understanding, the most knowledgeable, the most intelligent, the most bent on doing real good, the least tribal, like all of that. It's the core of secular humanism, but in historic terms, it's just utter nonsense. The moments of happiness, not the sense of well-being, fruition, fulfillment, security, or affection, or even a very good dinner, but the sudden illumination. So happiness here, let's not confuse that with temporarily being satisfied, but illumination, that moment in which sacramentally we experience eternity. We have a sudden intellection that is, it's not something that is thought out discursively, thought by thought, but it's that intuitive awareness of something that is the mystical experience. We had the experience, but missed the meaning. And approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form, beyond any meaning we can assign to happiness. So to have the experience, a visionary experience, a mystical experience, you can have the experience, but you can't have the meaning at the same time. And this is something that you see in almost all of the stories I'm familiar with visionaries, is that they have a vision, but the vision has to be explained to them later. To put the illumination of the divine into words is something that happens through a process of discursive thought, one thought after another. So having the experience, you miss the meaning, but an approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form. They later understand what the experience was. But understanding what the meaning of the experience was doesn't bring the experience back. That experience exists in memory, but now in a different form because we understand it beyond any meaning we can assign to happiness. I've said before that the past experience revived in the meaning is not the experience of one life only, but of many generations, not forgetting something that is probably quite ineffable. The backward look behind the assurance of recorded history, the backward half look over the shoulder towards the primitive terror. So when we have these moments, the sudden illumination that we experience is not limited to ourselves. That's the whole point of a divine illumination, is that it's not self-contained in who we are individually, Um, but it's an experience of the divine that goes back generations. Uh, the sense of God that is natural to all men. Uh, Something that is probably quite ineffable. Now we come to discover that the moments of agony, whether or not due to misunderstanding, having hoped for the wrong things or dreaded the wrong things is not in question, are likewise permanent, with such permanence as time has. We appreciate this better in the agony of others, nearly experienced, involving ourselves, than in our own. So on the complete opposite end, again, via positiva, via negativa, the moment of ecstasy, of illumination, and then also the moment of absolute agony. And it's irrelevant whether that agony is caused by our own misled loves, having hoped for the wrong things or dreaded the wrong things. That's irrelevant. The moment of agony is permanent with such permanence as time has, but we appreciate this better in the agony of others, not in our own. For our own past is covered by the currents of action, but the torments of others remains an experience unqualified, unworn by subsequent attrition. People change and smile, but the agony abides. And this, of course, is literally true that when we go through moments of agony, our self-conscious quite often steps in and either cuts it off or reinterprets it or finds a way of making the memory not quite as bad as the experience seemed at the time. And this is something that, I mean, you could see this in cognitive dissonance. This is exactly the sort of thing that Eliot's talking about. The psychological principle that when we hold two beliefs that are in conflict, something about ourselves and something about human experience, or what we experience as reality, um, if the experience in reality would force us to change our belief about ourselves in a negative way, rather than believing something bad about ourselves, we simply reinterpret reality. Um, it's impossible to recognize when you're doing this yourself, but everybody does it all day long. It's fairly easy to recognize cognitive dissonance in other people. As a high school teacher, I delight in explaining this one to teenagers, um, since teenagers are, you know, of the whole point of teenagerdom is to do stupid things and hopefully to learn from it. But as they're doing stupid things and having to deal with the subsequent shame and humiliation of it, the immediate human response to this is cognitive dissonance, to deny that that is what actually happened. Um, so when I ask my students if they ever remember a conversation with a friend in which they pointed out that the friend did something wrong, lied about something, did something that was just morally not upright, did the friend thank them for pointing out that what the friend had done was wrong? Or did the friend immediately defend themselves vociferously and with increasing rage, doubling down that they did not actually tell a lie or do something wrong? And that's the psychological protection that we give to ourselves, that Eliot's drawing on here, not in those psychological terms, but it's the exact experience. Um, Through subsequent life, we reinterpret things so that that agony is not what it was in the moment. When we see other people's agony, when we are present for other people's agony, we don't rationalize later on that it wasn't that bad, that what they were going through wasn't awful. Being close to their experience of agony gives a permanence that our own memories don't provide for our own. People change and smile, but the agony abides. Time the destroyer is time the preserver, like the river back to time, with its cargo of dead Negroes, cows, and chicken coops. The bitter apple and the bite in the apple, and the ragged rock in the restless waters. Waves, waves wash over it, fogs conceal it. On a halcyon day, it is merely a monument. In navigable weather, it is always a sea mark to lay course by. But in the somber season, or the sudden fury, is what it always was. So time the destroyer is time the preserver. This is a thought that directly applies to Hindu philosophy and mythology that will come across explicitly in the next section. Time the destroyer is time the preserver, and we think of that Mississippi River in the 1890s, only a generation away from slavery. The Mississippi River carrying down its cargo of dead Negroes, cows, and chicken coops. Again, T.S. Eliot never allows us to wish the world were better than it was. The bitter apple and the bite in the apple. And amongst everything that's taken down in the flood, an apple with a bite out of it. And we think of, the river floating things down slowly. And if we follow that river of time back, we go back to original sin. And now we move from the river to the ragged rock, the dry salvages. In the restless waters that watch over it, fog conceals it. On a clear day, in navigable weather, it's a sea mark that you lay course by. But in the somber season or the sudden fury is what it always was. And so if we go back to the opening lines of the river as a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, intractable. In the somber season or the sudden fury, when there's fog or storm, this sea mark goes back to what it actually is, or rather, it removes its appearance as something that's helpful, and it is what it always was, something that is potentially fate. So at that, we're going to pause for a couple of minutes. If there's any questions, go ahead, put them into chat or question and answer. And I'm going to put up a link in the chat, just the Wikipedia entry on the Bhagavad Gita. Eliot will refer to that repeatedly in part 3, the discussion between Prince Arjuna and Lord Krishna. And here, let us remember that T.S. Eliot did his dissertation on Eastern religious traditions. He read Sanskrit. He read the Bhagavad Gita in the original Sanskrit poetry. Oh, so a question whether Eliot was Catholic or not. Eliot was, as he described, Anglo-Catholic. In terms of his beliefs, doctrinally, he's Catholic, but he's part of that, the conservative wing of the Anglican Church. What was said about Eliot is that he exhausted his powers for conversion and converting himself to being English. So when it came to Christianity, he didn't have quite enough left to become fully Roman Catholic. And that, of course, is somewhat mocking, but there's some amount of truth to that. He was never baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. Um, but in terms of his beliefs are all Catholic. I would say his beliefs about everything except for um, the power structure of the church, which is something he has no interest in discussing in, I believe, any of his poetry. The power structure of the international church. He does write Murder in the Cathedral that is all about Thomas Becket and his martyrdom at the hands of King Henry II. Which, if you haven't seen, I don't know if they perform Murder in the Cathedral much, but it's absolutely fantastic. And it ends with a part that many viewers don't like. What's described in theater as breaking down the fourth wall. After the murder of Becket, the four knights who murder him turn to the audience and offer up their explanation of what just happened. And one of them makes the point that you sitting in the theater are enjoying the system that we created with this action. The modern world exists as it does, according to this last part of Murder in the Cathedral, because of the subjugation of church to state. And so, if we are going to criticize the Knights for killing Becket, we need to acknowledge the fact that we approve of precisely the system that their act created. And while we're on that topic, I can't mention Murder in the Cathedral without also mentioning the movie Becket, which is not at all related to the play of T.S. Eliot, but is one of the best movies on medieval culture by far. Um, One that presents characters truest to the motivations and desires of medieval people rather than modern people just, wearing a suit of armor. And anything that has Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton is going to be, for that reason, worth watching. Okay, we'll return and move on to part 3. I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant, among other things, or one way of putting the same thing, that the future is a faded song, a royal rose, or a lavender spray of wistful regret for those who are not yet here to regret, pressed between yellow leaves of a book that has never been opened. So we'll come to this description of putting the same thing. The future is a faded song. A faded song here referring to the sheet music um, being yellowed and faded through time. A royal rose or a lavender spray of wistful regret. The royal rose referring to the War of the Roses of Lancaster and York. But wistful regret for those who are not yet here to regret, pressed between yellow leaves of a book that has never been opened. And of course, if a book has never been opened, the leaves can't be yellowed yet because that is an effect of time. So what does all of this mean? Something that is not certainly material determines that the future is just something that will have to happen the way it will because of the interaction of materials under scientific principles, but rather the future as it was, just as the past is, and a future any different from the past is unimaginable. Um, the future itself already is. regret faded, aged for those who are not yet here to regret, for those who have yet to be born yet. If that's what Krishna meant. So now we have to get into the Bhagavad Gita. Um, the Bhagavad Gita is probably the most famous Hindu text. It's been described as, if any short document can express the core of Hinduism, it would be the Bhagavad Gita. It's a section of a much longer work called the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is the longest epic poem in existence. It's much longer than anything in Eastern traditions. I think it's 200,000 lines long. For comparison, the Iliad is 28,000 lines. So imagine 10 Iliads, more or less, and that's the Mahabharata. The Bhagavad Gita is just a small section, a few chapters of one of the books of the Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata was just sort of all of the epic tales of war in India's historic past. Legendary past, but somewhat historic. And at the beginning of the Kurukshetra between two families, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, the Prince Arjuna, who is a noble Kshatriya, the Kshatriyas were the warrior caste in the four castes of uh, Hindu society. They were the feudal lords, basically. And as the Pandavas and the Kauravas line up for battle, Arjuna looks across the other side and he is overwhelmed with sadness and despair. Um, all he can think about is the incredible suffering that is going to occur in this battle. That he will be responsible for the death of warriors. He'll be responsible for those women waiting at home for their husbands to return, and those husbands never do. Um, and Arjuna has a crisis of conscience about whether he can actually go ahead and do what is required of him. And Krishna, who is his charioteer, gives him counsel. And the counsel that Krishna gives is the Bhagavad Gita, which again is a pretty good summary of Hindu thought, according to Hindu scholars. Krishna is the avatar, one of the avatars of the Hindu god Vishnu. Hinduism is polytheistic, but it isn't. It has all of these gods, but it turns out that only one of the gods is actually supreme god, and just about anything you can say about Hinduism has to be qualified that way. In one of the major systems of Hinduism, Vishnu is the supreme god, and Krishna is one of the avatars, one of the incarnations that Vishnu frequently appears on Earth in the form of a human being, and that appearance of the god as a human is an avatar. So it's actually the god Vishnu who is telling Prince Arjuna what it is that he has to do. And it basically comes down to a discussion of dharma, which in Hinduism is the concept of duty. And the concept of duty relates not in a general sense to everybody, but in a specific sense to each individual. The duty of a Kshatriya warrior is very different than the duty of a Brahmin priest, which is different than the duty of a worker or a businessman. Everybody is required to do what is called of them in the social hierarchy. And to do that job to the best of their ability is to fulfill their dharma. But Krishna, he understands this, but he's still just distraught at the idea of his duty requires him to end the life of these other warriors. And the most famous chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is what's referred to as the vision of Arjuna. And at this time, he recognizes that Krishna is not just his charioteer, it is the incarnation of the god Vishnu. And he asks to see Vishnu in his reality as a god. And Krishna agrees to this and appears to him as Vishnu. And Arjuna is completely overwhelmed by what he sees. If 1,000 suns were to rise at once, such would be the vision before my eyes. And then he describes the vision of Vishnu until he comes to the last part of the vision, and he sees Vishnu turn into this vortex mouth that swallows all of the warriors that he saw on the field of battle. And Krishna tells him in an explanation of this, I am time, the destroyer of all. I have come to consume the world. Even without your participation, all the warriors gathered here will die. And this is the line that Oppenheimer quoted in an interview in 1965, that I've become death, destroyer of worlds. A different translation, but the same thought. But time, the destroyer of all, that's the time, the destroyer that he was just talking about. The point that is being made to Prince Arjuna is he has a role to play in the cosmic story, and he is not the one that decrees the death of these men. He is simply the instrument of Vishnu who has already decreed their death. So unlike what some commentators on Eliot would like to say, Eliot is not equating Krishna with Christ. He's pulling in from a different tradition on a point that is used. Eliot says explicitly that in terms of religious belief and philosophy, you have to believe that one is true and all else are false. Wisdom is universal, and that's what is the epigraph to the entire work, is that wisdom is universal, but everybody acts as though they have their own particular one. So the wisdom that can be found in these texts is applicable. The religious belief, however, is not. So this is not T.S. Eliot having some great interfaith dialogue. This is T.S. Eliot pulling upon an Eastern tradition to help be a case in point to what he is saying. And the way up is the way down. And that is the other line from Heraclitus that he uses in his epigraph. The way forward is the way back. You cannot face it steadily, but this thing is sure, that time is no healer. The patient is no longer here. When the train starts and the passengers are settled to fruit periodicals and business letters, and I'm sorry, has been copied and pasted wrong. That is the part of Burke Norton that was missing the first time that I did that. No, excuse me again. No, it's just so similar to those lines in Bert Norton that I thought I was rereading that. It's not the experience of the way up is the way down, the way forward is the way back. These are the correct lines. I just managed to confuse myself again. I suppose I haven't completely gotten out of the brain fog. You cannot face it steadily, but this thing is sure that time is no healer. The patient is not here. When the train starts and the passengers are settled to fruit periodicals and business letters, and those who saw them off have left the platform, their faces relax from grief into relief, to the sleepy rhythm of 100 hours. Fare forward, travelers, not escaping from the past into different lives or into any future. You are not the same people who left that station or who will arrive at any terminus. Another application of you can't enter the same river twice. The constant change that is life. You're not even the same person at the end of the train trip. While the narrowing rails slide together behind you, and on the deck of the drumming liner, watching the furrow that widens behind you, you shall not think the past is finished or the future is before us. At nightfall in the rigging and the aerial is a voice descanting, though not to the ear, the murmuring shell of time, and not in any language. Fare forward, you who think that you are voyaging. You are not those who saw the harbor receding, or those who will disembark. Here, between the hither and farther shore, while time is withdrawn, consider the future and the past with an equal mind. At the moment which is not of action or inaction, you can receive this. On whatever sphere of being the mind of a man may be intent at the time of death, that is the one action, and the time of death is every moment, which shall fructify in the lives of others. And out of Hinduism, the belief that whatever is on the mind of man at death, which is whatever a man is most attached to in life, that is what is called to mind in the moment of death. That determines your next reincarnation, because again, whatever you're thinking of is what your life was focused on. But Eliot takes that. We take this wisdom, that is the one action, and the time of death is every moment. So an ability to approach the world with equanimity, which literally means an equal mind, equanimity. Unusually, Eliot has taken the complex Latin verb and given us two simpler ones in English. We're not considering the future with hopes of what we will get. That was the lesson that we got out of last week. You do not perform things hoping for a particular result. So the moment which is not of action or inaction. The moment of living properly, once we've accepted that the fiat mihi, when we've given ourselves over to God's will. That moment, not of action or inaction, the time of death is every moment. We're focusing on what every lived moment in life should be, which we'll come up with explicitly later. And do not think of the fruit of action. Fare forward, O voyagers, O seamen, you who come to port, and you whose bodies will suffer the trial and judgment of the sea, or whatever event. This is your real destination. So Krishna, as when he admonished Arjuna on the field of battle, not farewell, but fare forward, voyagers. So as we're on this voyage here, the actual destination is not the port that we're coming into or the bottom of the sea that some will arrive at drowning in some sea catastrophe. The real destination is living fare forward, acting without fear, without a desired future. Arjuna wanted to act believing that he could prevent a particular future when his job was simply to do what his duty is. The image of our life as a journey and pulling into port is one of the oldest in Christianity. But the real destination is this faring forward, that as we are on the voyage, we live in every moment with the proper mindset. And that is what Krishna admonished Arjuna on the field of battle. Not farewell, but fare forward, voyagers. Do that which is required of you, regardless of your personal fears or your personal. And we'll take another brief moment. Section 4 is a very short one in the dry salvages, and section 5 is not particularly long either. Okay, so the fourth movement. And here, the specific reference that Eliot has in mind is in Gloucester. There is a particular church, the Church of Our Lady of the Good Voyage, and there's a statue of Our Lady um, with her arm outstretched in blessing to the sailors coming home. Lady, whose shrine stands on the promontory, pray for all those who are in ships, those whose business has to do with fish, and those concerned with every lawful traffic, and those who conduct them. Repeat a prayer also on behalf of women who have seen their sons or husbands setting forth and not returning. Figlia del tuo figlio, Queen of Heaven. Also pray for those who were in ships and ended their voyage on the sand, in the sea's lips, or in the dark throat which will not reject them, or wherever cannot reach them the sound of the sea bells, perpetual Angelus. So we have, a prayer to the Virgin, praying for the lady's protection over all sailors, everyone that he's referenced here in this section. Figlia del tuo figlio. He's quoting Dante here in St. Bernard's prayer to the Virgin at the beginning of Paradiso 33. Um, Figlia del tuo figlio means daughter of your son, Queen of Heaven. And we pray for those who were in ships, who either ended their voyage on sand, in the sea's lips, or in the dark throat that will not reject them. So those who came to port, those who suffered the trial and judgment of the sea. And now the sound of the sea bell, which is that warning for ships in fog and bad weather. The sound of that sea bell takes on a new timelessness, not just the timelessness of the sea, but a perpetual Angelus. And the Angelus is the prayer said at in morning, noon, and evening um, about the Annunciation. So the sea bell's perpetual Angelus, the sea bell's perpetual Annunciation, the Annunciation being repeated now throughout all of human history, constantly calling to us. The final movement. Um, and these opening lines, there's, in my mind, there's definitely a bit of sardonic humor. I think T.S. Eliot's sense of humor is somewhat like Dante's. To communicate with Mars, converse with spirits, to report the behavior of the sea monster, describe the horoscope, haruspicate or scry, observe disease in signatures, evoke biography from the wrinkles of the palm and tragedy from the fingers, release omens by sortilege or tea leaves, riddle with the inevitable with playing cards, fiddle with pentagrams or barbituric acid, or dissect the recurrent image into preconscious terrors, to explore the womb or tomb or dreams. All these are the usual pastimes and drugs and features of the press, and always will be, some of them especially, when there is distress of nations and perplexity, whether on the shores of Asia or in the Edgware Road. So we have in the first 13 lines here the list of what we could say divinity on demand. That is horoscopes, astrology, necromancy. To haruspicate is, and to scry, those are other ancient forms of divination, chiromancy, reading palms, releasing omens by sortilege, which is some form of calling lots, picking things at random. Tea leaves, tarot cards, pentagrams, or barbituric acids. So now we go on into recreational drug use to dissect the recurrent image into preconscious terrors. So dream interpretation through either psychology or through Jungian archetypes. To explore the womb or tomb or dreams, all these are usual pastimes and drugs and features of the press. And what do all of these have in common is mankind is seeking knowledge that is ordinarily denied to. Mankind wants to know the future. Whenever in medieval texts they talk about the forbidden practices of divination, um, it's always describing those things which are of the hidden and future things. So things that we either don't know about because they haven't happened, or things that we don't know about because we can't have natural knowledge of them, even though they're going on right now. All of these are the usual pastimes and drugs, and always will be, especially when there's distress. Men's curiosity searches past and future and clings to that dimension. But to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death in love, ardor, and selflessness and self-surrender. So the difference between all of these drugs and pastimes, and the reason all of those are forbidden by the church, man's curiosity, desire to know what is beyond his limits, and most importantly, using these methods to try to know what is not knowable, is a way of trying to become like God yourself. Go back to Genesis 3, what the serpent promised is, no, you will become like gods with knowledge, men's curiosity. The only genuine way to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time. So the definition here of the sacramentalist worldview here is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken. This is not something you can choose for yourself. In a lifetime's death in love, ardor, and selflessness and self-surrender. So only the saint who lives a lifetime of moments of death. What Elliot was talking about earlier. And the time of death is every moment. The saint is one in a lifetime's death in love, ardor, and selflessness and self-surrender. The difference between the saint and the rest of us is that the saint is able to live in this state. Again, not out of choice, but by grace. They responded to that grace positively, but it's not as though they decided to be able to live this way. This isn't just a curiosity or a pastime, it's the occupation of the saint, the occupation that is given. For most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, the distraction fit lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, or the winter lightning, or the waterfall, or music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. These are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses, and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood, is incarnation. Here, the impossible union of spheres of existence is actual. Here, the past and future are conquered and reconciled. Where action were otherwise movement of that which is only moved and has in it no source of movement, driven by demonic chthonic powers. And right action is freedom from past and future also. For most of us, this is the aim never here to be realized. We are only undefeated because we have gone on trying. We content at the last, if our temporal reversion nourish, not too far from the yew tree, the life of significant soil. So to apprehend the point of intersection of timelessness with time, um, and to apprehend there is not to understand, it's not to logically deduce, it's not that question of discursive thought, it's that moment of sudden illumination. That is apprehension in the usage that Eliot is following here, which is according to the medieval psychological usage. This is not something that's arrived at through conscious thought, A, therefore B, etc. It is that intuitive awareness. That is something that is only given to the saint. For the rest of us, though, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time. The sudden illumination that we can have, which is not the full apprehension of timelessness with time, that is literally sacrament. We have momentary illumination, the distraction fit, being lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, or the winter lightning, or the waterfall, or music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. Those uncanny moments that we experience. But they're not the apprehension of timelessness with time. They're just hints and guesses. But the hints and guesses are true, is what Eliot's getting at here. They are reliable guides to reality. And reality with the capital R is joy. It is, when he was speaking earlier, of happiness, not of momentary satisfaction, but the happiness that comes out of that momentary illumination. Reality with a capital R is joy. And the hints that put us in that direction. The way we feel when you are the music while the music lasts. Hints and guesses. The hints and guesses are incarnation. But everything else for the rest of us is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. There is no easy way out. The modern man that wants to command the universe, that wants to command knowledge, power, everything else, and wants it now. I mean, that is literally the path of the devil. For those of us who aren't granted the occupation of the saint and the apprehension of timelessness with time, we do it through hard work. And the hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation with a capital I, the impossible union of spheres of existence. Where, I mean, incarnation is the supreme moment of timelessness meeting time. Here, the past and future are conquered and reconciled. Where action or otherwise movement of that which is only moved and has in it no source of movement. Right action is freedom. The right action to do what is one's duty without the doubt and worry of Prince Arjuna. The worry that the right thing to do could be wrong because of what will result of it. We have to do what is right because it is right, rather than because we hope it brings about a certain thing. For most of us, this is the aim never here to be realized. Who are only undefeated because we have gone on trying. And we go back to the discussion you had last week The fifth movement last week was all about poetry. Uh, the 20 years wasted between the two wars learning to say something in words that no longer apply. Comparing, he's not competing with past masters. There's only the trying. There's only the trying of the poet to set the experience, the knowledge, not something new, but what all poets have been trying to say throughout the ages. All they can do is applaud themselves on the trying, because even the best attempt fails miserably short of reality with the capital R, that is God. We aim for all of these things. Well, what we have to do is simply continue trying. Prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. We content at the last if our temporal reversion, the life of significant soil, not too far from the yew tree. So we go back to Bert Norton and East Coker here. That our end on earth is to be buried and to nourish significant soil. And not too far from the yew tree. The yew tree in England is always significant of church cemeteries. So our end is already determined, that our end on earth is the death of the body. But we try to do what we're supposed to do. We try to live. We can't hope for a lifetime's death in love, art, or selflessness. No, we can hope for that. We can't choose that on our own. That is a gift of grace. But to be able to live through prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action, to have these as the result, we can hope for that. And we can hope that at the end, our earthly life is one that is a nourishment for that significant soil that will be the final resting place of all of our lives until the resurrection and the reunion of all flesh with spirit. Okay. Oh, and there we are, almost right on time. Okay, so that is the dry solid ages. Next week, we'll have the fourth quartet, Little Gidding, which refers to an actual pilgrimage place in England. So thank you for attending again. I look forward to seeing you next week.